The wind of the Kansas plains carried a certain loneliness that November afternoon of 1995. Golden wheat fields swayed beneath a pale sky, and the town of Elkhart moved at its usual slow pace, unaware that by sunset, life here would never feel ordinary again. People still talk about that day, when 10-year-old Michael Reed vanished after school pickup, a mystery that would haunt this quiet corner of the Midwest for nearly 3 decades. If you love true stories of justice long delayed but never forgotten, make sure to subscribe to our channel, because what you're about to hear is not only about loss, but about resilience, redemption, and the truth that refused to stay buried. Michael Reed was known in town as a bright, curious boy. His teacher once said he had a mind older than his age, always asking questions about how the world worked, why people acted the way they did, and how far Kansas really stretched before the earth curved. He lived with his mother, Sarah Reed, a teacher's aide at the local elementary school, who juggled her work and long evenings cleaning offices to keep their modest home standing. Elkhart wasn't the kind of place where bad things happened. Main Street held 2 diners, 1 gas station, and a library that doubled as a community center. Neighbors left their doors unlocked, kids rode bikes past sunset, and Friday night football brought everyone together. But beneath the simple life lay quiet struggles, bills unpaid, grudges unspoken, and a longing for something beyond the endless horizon. On that November day, the school bell rang as usual at 3 p.m. Michael was seen waiting by the gravel road near the pickup area, clutching his worn-out notebook, a baseball cap tilted low over his brow. Several students waved goodbye as buses rolled away. Sarah, delayed at her second job across town, had planned to pick him up around 3:30, but by the time she arrived, the road was empty. The wind carried dust, not footprints. At first, no one panicked. "He's probably with a friend," one teacher said. Sheriff Tom Halbrook, a man known for his steady calm, told Sarah they'd find him before dark. He meant it. People trusted Halbrook. But as the evening sun dipped, the laughter faded from the schoolyard, replaced by the sound of calling voices and crunching boots over frozen soil. By nightfall, a dozen flashlights swept across open fields. The local pastor brought coffee to volunteers. Dogs barked at shadows. Sarah's voice cracked as she called out Michael's name again and again into the cold. The stars hung bright above the plains, silent witnesses to something none of them could yet understand. Every town has its secrets. Elkhart's began that night, with a missing boy, a mother's cry, and a silence that would last 30 years. November 3rd, 1995 began like any other Friday in Elkhart. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of dry soil and harvest. Children shuffled into classrooms with jackets half-zipped, their laughter echoing through the narrow hallways of Elkhart Elementary. For Sarah Reed, it was payday, a small relief before the long weekend. For Michael, it was the day he'd been waiting for all week. He had drawn a comic in his notebook about space explorers and couldn't wait to show it to his best friend, Tommy Hurst. At lunch, Michael traded a peanut butter sandwich for a pack of baseball cards. He laughed easily, full of that unguarded confidence kids have when the world still feels safe. His teacher, Mrs. Daniels, later recalled how he'd stayed a few minutes after class to help her stack books. "You're a good kid, Michael," she told him. He just smiled, said, "Mum says helping is free," and ran off toward the buses. The final bell rang at 3 sharp. Dust rose as the old yellow buses rumbled to life. Michael usually waited at the pickup area near the east gate, under a sycamore tree that had lost most of its leaves. He wore his navy blue hoodie and carried his notebook tucked under one arm. A few classmates saw him talking to the bus driver, Mr. Lannister, before stepping back onto the road. Nothing seemed unusual. Sarah was supposed to pick him up by 3:30, but a copier broke at the office she cleaned, forcing her to stay an extra 20 minutes. She called the school at 3:45. No answer. By the time she reached the pickup area at 4, the sky had begun to dim. The buses were gone, and the only sound was the steady hum of wind moving across the fields. She parked by the gravel road, honked twice, then stepped out, her shoes crunching against frost. "Michael," she called. The wind swallowed her voice. The school building stood silent, locked for the weekend. A custodian, Mr. Weaver, emerged from a side door carrying a mop bucket. "You looking for someone?" he asked. When she said her son's name, his expression shifted. He set the bucket down. "I saw him earlier, around 3. Thought he was waiting on you." They searched the playground first, then the baseball field, then the short path leading toward the woods. By 5, Sheriff Halbrook arrived in his pickup, radio crackling. "We'll find him, Sarah," he said, though his eyes betrayed concern. As the light faded, more people joined, neighbors, teachers, parents. They combed the fields with flashlights, calling his name into the cold. By 8 o'clock, the temperature had dropped near freezing. Sarah's voice was hoarse, her hands numb. A volunteer handed her a blanket, but she barely felt it. "He's never wandered off," she whispered. "He hates the dark." That night no one in Elkhart slept, and though no one dared to say it aloud, a quiet dread began to settle, the kind that comes when the familiar turns unrecognizable, and a mother's hope is all that's left to light the dark. By dawn the next morning, the whole town of Elkhart seemed to hold its breath. Frost blanketed the grass behind the elementary school, and volunteers gathered near the parking lot with thermoses of coffee and tired eyes. Sheriff Tom Halbrook stood at the center, giving quiet instructions. His voice was steady, but his hands, gripping a worn clipboard, betrayed the weight of what was unfolding. "Start along the creek bed," he told a group of men with flashlights and dogs. "Work your way east toward the silos. We'll grid the fields 1 mile at a time." Sarah Reed stood nearby, wrapped in a borrowed coat, her face pale from a sleepless night. Neighbors approached with sympathetic words that barely registered. "We'll find him, Sarah," someone said. "He's a tough kid." She nodded without replying, her eyes locked on the endless horizon. By mid-morning, the sound of boots crunching frost mixed with the low murmur of radios. Searchers waded through tall grass, peered inside barns, and called Michael's name over and over. A few kids from his class helped post flyers at the gas station and diner. The local pastor led a short prayer near the schoolyard, asking for strength and clarity. The town's unity was palpable. Every face showed determination, every voice carried hope. But as hours stretched into the afternoon, unease began to replace optimism. There were no footprints beyond the road, no dropped belongings, no signs of struggle. Sheriff Halbrook met with his 2 deputies by the patrol car. "No leads?" he asked. One shook his head. "Not a trace, sir." "It's like he vanished into thin air." Halbrook rubbed his temple. "Nobody disappears into thin air," he said quietly. At home, Sarah sat on the edge of her couch, surrounded by Michael's belongings, his backpack, a half-eaten candy bar, his favorite red pencil. The house felt unbearably still. A neighbor, Mrs. Garza, brought over soup and whispered, "You should try to rest." Sarah only murmured, "I can't. What if he comes home and I'm not here?" By sunset, temperatures dropped again. Flashlights flickered across open farmland, but the mood had shifted. Conversations grew shorter, faces more drawn. Someone mentioned coyotes, someone else mentioned strangers passing through town. The sheriff dismissed wild speculation, but even he felt the shadow of something larger than a simple disappearance. That night, a storm front rolled in from the west, bringing wind and sleet that forced searchers to retreat. Halbrook promised to resume at first light. He parked his patrol truck near the Reeds' driveway and told Sarah, "We're not stopping." "I give you my word." She looked at him, tears stinging her eyes. "You have a son, don't you?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Then you understand." The sheriff tipped his hat and returned to his truck. Inside, he sat for a long time before turning the key. His reflection stared back at him in the windshield. A man sworn to protect his town, now realizing he might be chasing a ghost. Outside, the wind howled through the empty streets, carrying with it the sound of a mother's whisper into the night, "Please, Michael, just come home." By the 3rd day of searching, exhaustion had settled over Elkhart like a heavy fog. The town's energy, once unified by hope, began to fragment into fear and suspicion. Everyone knew everyone in this place, or at least they thought they did. And when people can't find answers, they start looking for someone to blame. Sheriff Halbrook sat inside his office, a half-drained cup of coffee on his desk, reports stacked high. The heater hummed weakly against the early winter chill. Deputy Miles entered quietly, holding a clipboard. "We've rechecked the pickup logs," he said. The last adult seen near Michael was the bus driver, Rick Lannister. Halbrook looked up. "Lannister?" He frowned. "He's worked the route for 12 years. Never had trouble." "Still," Miles replied, "a couple of kids said he talked to Michael before he disappeared. Maybe we should ask." By noon, Lannister was sitting across from the sheriff, his cap clutched in his hands. He was a heavy-set man in his 40s, known for his punctuality and quiet nature. "I already told the deputy," he muttered, eyes darting between them. "I saw the boy. He said his mum was late, so I waited a minute. Then I left." Halbrook leaned forward. "Anyone else there?" "Just the janitor, maybe." "I didn't see much after that. You didn't think to call it in when he didn't leave?" Rick hesitated, his throat tightening. "I figured his mom came. Wasn't my place to meddle." It was a simple exchange, but something in his tone made the sheriff uneasy. There was a tremor. Not guilt, perhaps, but fear. When asked if he had any reason to return to the school later, Rick shook his head too quickly. That evening, whispers spread fast. At the diner, two waitresses traded hushed theories. "They're saying the bus driver knew more than he told the cops." Across the street, old Mr. Weber told anyone who'd listen, "You never really know folks, even the ones you see every day." Halbrook didn't like how the rumors were spreading. He knew how fragile small towns could be under pressure. And yet the evidence, or lack of it, forced him to keep pushing. He ordered a search of Lannister's property, a small farmhouse 2 miles from the school. Deputies combed through the barn and fields, turning up nothing but spare tires and tools. Rick's wife wept when reporters arrived. "He's not that kind of man," she said, clutching her apron. "He's got 2 daughters of his own." When the search came back clean, Halbrook called off the team. "We can't build a case on rumors," he told Miles. But privately, he couldn't shake the doubt pressing against his conscience. He'd seen men lie to protect themselves, and he'd seen men crumble under false blame. Sometimes both looked the same. That night, Sarah watched the local news in silence as they mentioned a person of interest. She recognized the face and whispered, "He always waved at Michael." Then she turned off the TV, her heart torn between a desperate need for answers and the terror of what those answers might mean. Winter turned into spring, and by the time the fields turned green again, Michael Reed's name was no longer on every tongue. The flyers weathered by rain peeled from telephone poles, and the nightly vigils thinned until only Sarah remained. She sat on her porch each evening, watching the sun set behind the grain elevators, listening to the faint hum of the highway, waiting for a sound that never came. In the sheriff's office, the case file grew thick with reports, but thin with hope. Every lead ended the same way: unanswered questions, vague sightings, false confessions. Sheriff Halbrook kept Michael's photo tacked above his desk, a reminder of the boy who'd vanished from beneath their noses. "Some cases," he once told his deputy, "don't end. They just get quieter." By 1997, the town of Elkhart had learned to live with the void. Children grew cautious. Parents drove them everywhere. Life pressed on. Weddings, harvests, new businesses. But something in the town's spirit had changed. People smiled less, trusted less, spoke in whispers when they passed the old school. It was as though innocence itself had vanished along with the boy. Sarah refused to leave. She took on extra shifts at the school, helping organize events, cleaning classrooms after hours. The teachers treated her gently, with a mix of sympathy and unease. Some whispered that she should move on, but she couldn't, not while her son's face haunted her dreams. One evening, she visited Sheriff Halbrook, who had aged noticeably. The grey in his beard matched the weariness in his eyes. "It's been 2 years, Tom," she said softly. "How long do you keep looking before you stop pretending?" He set down his pen, met her gaze, and said, "Until someone tells me otherwise." His words were firm, but his tone lacked conviction. When she left, he looked at Michael's picture one last time that night, then quietly turned it face down. As years passed, Sarah transformed her pain into purpose. In 2003, she founded the Reed Foundation, a volunteer group dedicated to supporting families of missing children across Kansas. What began as grief became action. She spoke in schools, organized searches, and offered comfort to parents walking the same impossible road. Her strength inspired many, though she still woke in the middle of the night, certain she'd heard her son's voice calling from the yard. In small towns, tragedy becomes folklore. By 2010, local teenagers told stories of the boy who disappeared, daring each other to walk near the old sycamore after dark. Adults avoided the topic altogether. The case file gathered dust in the evidence room, tucked behind newer crimes and newer sorrows. Sarah never remarried. She kept Michael's room the same, baseball cards on the dresser, notebook on the desk, sneakers under the bed. Every year on November 3rd, she lit a candle and whispered, "I still see you." And though time dulled the edges of memory for most, for her it remained sharp, a wound that refused to close, pulsing softly beneath the surface of everyday life, waiting for the truth that the years had yet to reveal. The year was 2023, and the air in Elkhart carried the same dry scent of dust and diesel it always had. Nearly 3 decades had passed since Michael Reed's disappearance, and for most it had become an echo from another lifetime. The town had grown older, quieter, but for Detective Emily Carter that echo was what brought her home. Emily had grown up 70 miles east of Elkhart in Dodge City. As a child, she remembered seeing Michael's face on missing posters tacked to grocery store bulletin boards. It was one of the first stories that had unsettled her, the idea that a boy her age could simply vanish between school and home. That unease had never left her. Now at 34, with a decade in law enforcement behind her, she was transferring to Morton County to take over a retiring investigator's post. Her first morning in the small sheriff's office, she noticed the old case files stacked against a back wall. A thick folder labeled Reed Michael, 1995, sat among them, its edges yellowed and curling. When she asked about it, the deputy chuckled. "That one? It's cursed. Every new detective reads it once, thinks they'll solve it, then gives up." Emily didn't smile. Maybe they just didn't read it right. She took the file to her desk, brushing off the layer of dust. Inside were black and white photos, handwritten notes, faded maps, pieces of a puzzle long abandoned. The last update was dated 2002. As she read, the story she remembered from childhood unfolded in raw detail. The missed pickup, the fruitless searches, the rumors that tore through the town. But something caught her attention. A mention of unprocessed evidence stored in Wichita due to budget constraints. She made a note in her small leather notebook. DNA samples, check chain of custody. Later that week, she met Sheriff Dave Hollis, who'd taken over after Halbrook's retirement. "You're digging into the Reed case?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. "That file's older than half our deputies." "I know," Emily said evenly, "but old doesn't mean dead." He studied her for a long moment. "You really think you'll find something everyone else missed?" "I think no one's looked hard enough in a long time," she replied. That evening she drove out to the school, now remodeled and renamed. The sycamore tree was gone, replaced by a paved parking lot. The place looked smaller than she remembered. She imagined a boy standing there, notebook under his arm, waiting for a ride that never came. The silence pressed around her like memory itself. When she returned to her motel, she opened the case file again, this time reading every report line by line. Somewhere inside the stale ink and faded photos, she felt a presence, not of the boy, but of a story still incomplete. 30 years, she murmured to herself. That's long enough to stay silent. And as the clock ticked past midnight, she wrote the first words of a new report. Case reopened, pending review. Detective Emily Carter had been in Elkhart for 2 weeks when the quiet rhythm of small-town policing began to give way to obsession. Her days were filled with paperwork and neighbor disputes, but her nights belonged entirely to the Reed case. Every evening, the office light burned long after everyone else had gone home, the sound of papers shifting breaking the silence like whispers from the past. She started by reading every interview, every report, every name mentioned, circling inconsistencies in red ink. The language in the 1995 statements was fragmented, rushed notes, misspelled names, gaps in timelines. It wasn't incompetence, she thought, just the limits of the time. But one line kept tugging at her. Collected fabric sample from site east of school, sent to Wichita for analysis. There was no follow-up, no lab report, just a single notation, pending budget approval. She called the State Evidence Storage Center in Wichita the next morning. After hours of transfers and holds, a woman finally answered. Morton County 1995 case. You're lucky, that's ancient. Most of those are gone. Gone? Emily repeated sharply. Destroyed, most likely. Budget clear-outs in the early 2000s. Emily's grip tightened on the phone. Check again, she said, please. Minutes later, the woman returned. You've got one envelope, unopened. Labeled as possible fiber evidence. It's yours if you want to sign it out. That night, Emily drove to Wichita herself. The evidence clerk handed her a small, sealed package, dust-coated and brittle with age. Inside was a clear bag containing a torn piece of navy blue fabric, slightly faded, with a fragment of what looked like a metal snap. She stared at it for a long time, the hum of fluorescent lights above her the only sound. Back in her motel, she spread the old crime scene photos across the bed. The east side of the school grounds, a narrow path near the creek. In one photo, barely visible, something dark peeked from the grass. Could it be the same piece of fabric? Her mind raced. Why had no one followed up? The next morning, she requested the item be sent to the Kansas Bureau of Investigation for DNA and material analysis. The technician on the line, a man named Porter, sounded doubtful. That sample's nearly 30 years old, he said. You might get nothing. I'll take nothing over silence, Emily replied. While she waited, she began interviewing retired officers who'd worked the case. Some were polite, others defensive. One, a former deputy named Cole Avery, paused too long when she mentioned the fabric. Yeah, he said slowly. I remember that. Found it near the fence line, right? That's what the report says. He rubbed his chin. Funny thing is, I thought it looked like part of a uniform, but nobody wanted to chase that angle back then. Emily's pulse quickened. A uniform? As in law enforcement? Cole shrugged. Could have been, or maybe I was wrong, it was dark. He avoided her eyes, and though he said nothing more, she knew he'd told her something that wasn't in the files, something that could shift the entire story. When the call from the KBI finally came, Emily was sitting in her office surrounded by open files and half-drunk coffee. Porter's voice on the line carried a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Detective Carter, we got something from that fabric you sent. She straightened immediately. Go on. It's degraded, but there's a partial DNA trace. Not enough for a full profile, but the fiber itself. He paused. It's standard-issue polyester blend used in law enforcement uniforms from the 1990s. Morton County, to be specific. Emily felt her pulse spike. You're telling me that fabric came from a deputy's uniform? Not conclusive, Porter said, but it's a strong match for the manufacturer that supplied the department back then. She hung up slowly, her mind spinning. In 1995, there were only 8 deputies in the Morton County Sheriff's Office. Half of them were dead or retired. One name stood out, Mark Connolly, a decorated officer who'd later become the department's training supervisor. His record was spotless. He'd even been part of the original search for Michael Reed. Emily pulled his personnel file. The dates aligned. Connolly had been on duty the day of Michael's disappearance and had logged volunteer hours assisting the investigation afterward. She scanned the original witness statements again and saw it. Connolly had been the first officer to arrive at the school that evening, claiming to help organize the search grid. That detail had never been followed up. Why? She drove to the county records building, rain streaking the windshield. The archive clerk, an older woman with a faded name tag, looked surprised when Emily requested the 1995 shift rosters. After a moment, the woman returned with a yellowing binder. Inside, the handwritten entries told a story no one had questioned in decades. On November 3rd, Connolly's shift ended at 2:45 p.m., 15 minutes before Michael was last seen. Emily stared at the page, her breath shallow. The world seemed to narrow to a single point: the boy's disappearance, the fabric, the uniform, the timing. She copied the records and drove back in silence, the rain tapping against the glass like impatient fingers. Her mind raced through possibilities, memories, motives. Connolly had been young then, recently promoted, respected by everyone. Why would someone like him? No, she told herself, don't assume, find proof. At the office, she called Sheriff Hollis. I need to talk to you, she said. He sighed. If this is about that old case again. It's not old, she cut in. It's active. I have a fabric sample tied to department uniforms from 1995 and a deputy who was unaccounted for during the exact window Michael Reed disappeared. There was silence on the line, then a measured reply. You're accusing one of our own, Emily. You better be damn sure before you say that out loud. I'm not accusing, she said. I'm following the evidence. It's starting to speak. When she hung up, the wind outside howled across the empty fields. For the first time she felt it. The case was no longer cold. It was waking up. And someone, somewhere in Elkhart, had to know that truth was coming. Word travels fast in a small town even when no one wants it to. By the end of the week, whispers about the new detective digging into an old hero had spread across Elkhart like wildfire. At the diner on Main Street, coffee cups paused mid-air as conversations shifted to hushed tones. Did you hear? Someone murmured. She's saying Connolly had something to do with that boy's disappearance. Detective Emily Carter knew it was coming. The morning after her call with Sheriff Hollis, he'd visited her office, his jaw tight. People are talking, he warned. You're stirring ghosts that built this town. I'm following the evidence, she said evenly. Evidence isn't the same as truth, he replied, then left without another word. By afternoon, the lines were drawn. Half the town rallied behind Connolly, a man they saw as the symbol of integrity. The deputy who'd coached Little League, helped rebuild the church roof, and attended every community fundraiser for 30 years. The other half, quieter but growing, whispered that maybe it was time to ask the questions no one dared to ask in 1995. Emily walked into the grocery store that evening, and the room seemed to still. Mrs. Weaver, the clerk, looked uncomfortable as she scanned items. You're causing a lot of noise, Detective, she said softly. Mark Connolly's been good to folks here. People don't like seeing his name dragged through the dirt. Emily met her gaze. If he's innocent, the truth will clear him. If he's not, people deserve to know. Outside, the wind had picked up again, carrying dust down Main Street. Across the road, an old man stood by his truck and called out, You think you're better than us, missy? Coming here after all these years to dig up pain we buried long ago? Emily didn't answer. She simply got in her car and drove toward the edge of town, where the fields opened wide and the silence felt less hostile. Meanwhile, Sarah Reed sat in her living room, the phone ringing off the hook with neighbors' questions. She hadn't spoken to Emily since the detective first reopened the case. That evening, she finally called her. You think this man, this deputy, had something to do with it? Sarah asked quietly. I don't know yet, Emily said, but his name keeps showing up where it shouldn't. Sarah hesitated. He helped me search that night. He was kind. I remember his flashlight beam cutting through the fields. People can help, Emily said, and still hide something. For a long moment, neither spoke. The past hung between them like a fragile thread, one pull away from breaking. Do what you have to do, Sarah finally said. Just don't let them forget my boy. As night settled over Elkhart, the divisions deepened. Church groups held prayer meetings for Connolly's good name. Others gathered quietly outside the sheriff's office, asking for accountability. The town that once came together in grief was now splitting apart under the weight of buried truth. Emily looked out her motel window, lights flickering in the distance. The wind carried faint voices of doubt, loyalty, and fear. She whispered to herself, this town doesn't know how close it is to cracking. 3 days after the town began to turn on itself, a plain brown envelope appeared on Detective Emily Carter's desk. No return address, no postage, just her name typed neatly in the center. It hadn't come through the mail. Someone had walked into the sheriff's office and left it there, unnoticed. Emily studied it for a moment, her instincts tightening. Inside, folded with precision, was a single handwritten page. The handwriting was shaky, almost trembling, but legible. The first line made her stomach clench. It wasn't meant to happen. He was just scared. I tried to stop it. She read the rest in silence, her eyes tracing each desperate line. The letter didn't name names, but it spoke of guilt, of fear, and of a night that went wrong by the creek east of the school. It mentioned a uniform, a flashlight, and the sound of someone crying in the dark. At the bottom, unsigned, a final plea. Please forgive what can't be undone. Her mind raced. The handwriting was old, the ink slightly faded, but the paper was clean as though written recently. Someone out there still carried the weight of that night. She made copies and sealed the original in an evidence bag. Sheriff Hollis appeared in the doorway as she finished labeling it. "What now?" he asked, scanning her expression. "Now," Emily replied quietly. "Now we find out who's ready to confess, and who's praying I never do." That evening she met Sarah Reed at her house, bringing the letter with her. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she read it. Her voice cracked when she whispered, This means he was alive that night, doesn't it?" Emily hesitated. "It means someone knows what happened. Someone who's carried it for years." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Then they've lived free while my boy's been gone. That's not right." Emily nodded. "No, it's not." Back at the station, she began analyzing the clues hidden between the words. He was just scared. It wasn't written in self-reference. Someone else had caused harm, while the writer had tried to intervene. 2 people. Maybe more. The tone suggested remorse but also fear, the kind that doesn't fade over time. She compared the letter's style with old personnel records, focusing on deputies from the 1990s. One name, one handwriting sample caught her attention. A man who died in 2008, a junior deputy who had worked directly under Mark Connolly. His notes from that period bore similar flourishes, the same looped R's, the same sharp S's. The realization struck hard. The letter hadn't been written by the guilty man alone. It was the voice of someone who had watched, who had carried silence like a curse, and before dying left behind one final attempt at truth. Emily leaned back, staring at the evidence board now littered with threads connecting names, dates, and regrets. Somewhere beneath all this, a secret partnership had lived for 30 years, one built not on loyalty, but on fear. She whispered to herself, if one tried to stop it, the other never did. 2 weeks later, the call came just after sunrise. Detective Emily Carter was driving past the Reed property when her phone buzzed against the console. Porter's voice carried the kind of tension that precedes something irreversible. "Detective, you might want to sit down for this." She pulled over on the empty highway. The horizon stretched gold and grey before her. "Tell me." The lab ran mitochondrial sequencing on that old fabric sample and cross-referenced it with familial DNA from the Reed Foundation's Missing Persons Registry. It's faint, degraded, but it's a match. Michael Reed's biological material was found on that uniform fragment. For a long moment, Emily said nothing. The hum of her engine filled the silence. Finally, she whispered, "You're certain?" "As certain as 30-year-old evidence can be," Porter replied. "Whatever happened to that boy, it happened near someone wearing a Morton County deputy's uniform." The words pressed like weight on her chest. Every theory, every suspicion suddenly had a pulse. She thanked him, hung up, and sat still, watching a hawk circle over the frozen fields. Truth had always been her pursuit, but now it felt like something heavy enough to break her if she carried it alone. At the station, Sheriff Hollis listened in grim silence. When she finished explaining, he leaned back in his chair. "If this gets out, it'll burn everything," he said quietly. "You're talking about accusing one of our own, someone this town worships." "I'm not accusing anyone," Emily said. "The evidence is." He rubbed his jaw, then sighed. "You'd better hope it's wrong." That afternoon she called Sarah Reed. Her voice was careful, almost hesitant. "Sarah, there's been a development." They confirmed Michael's DNA on one of the pieces of evidence. On the other end, Sarah was silent. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled. So it's real, all these years, and he was right there. All this time. Emily swallowed hard. We're closer than ever. I promise you that. Later that evening, Sarah drove to the sheriff's office, carrying a small cardboard box. Inside were Michael's personal items, the few things she'd kept untouched. A baseball cap, a folded school notebook, and a keychain he'd won at the county fair. You said the lab could test these, right? She asked softly. Emily nodded, accepting the box. I'll have them checked. Every piece matters now. When Sarah left, the weight of the box lingered in Emily's hands. She set the items on her desk, tracing her fingers over the cap's faded brim. The evidence felt alive, pulsing with history and grief. That night, alone in her office, she pinned a photo of Michael Reed above her board. Beneath it, she placed the note, DNA confirmed. Then she added another beneath Connolly's picture, deputy on scene, unaccounted time. The wind outside howled against the windows, and she whispered into the dim light, We're almost there, Michael. Almost. But in the quiet that followed, she felt a chill, the kind that comes when the truth isn't just close, but ready to confront you face to face. Detective Emily Carter parked outside Mark Connolly's farmhouse on a grey Kansas morning. The clouds hung low, heavy with unshed rain. For 3 nights she had gone over the evidence again and again, searching for doubt, for error, for mercy. But the facts were solid, immovable. The torn fabric, the DNA, the letter, the shift records, they all converged on one name. Connolly opened the door before she could knock. He was older now, his shoulders stooped, his hair white around the edges. Still, his eyes were sharp, the kind that missed nothing. Detective Carter, he said with calm familiarity. I figured this day might come. Emily studied him carefully. Then you know why I'm here. He stepped aside. Come in. Inside, the house smelled of coffee and old books. Family photos lined the mantel, smiling faces, grandchildren, the illusion of a peaceful life. He gestured toward a chair. I've got nothing to hide, he said. I hope that's true, Emily replied, sitting down. For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the ticking of an old clock filled the silence. Then she placed the folder on the table. We recovered a piece of uniform fabric from near the school grounds. It tested positive for Michael Reed's DNA. Connolly's jaw tensed, but he didn't look surprised. You've done your homework, he murmured. I've done my job, she corrected. 30 years late, maybe, but not too late. He leaned back, rubbing his temple. You think I hurt that boy? I think you were there, Emily said. And I think something happened that night that's been eating at you ever since. For the first time, his gaze faltered. He stared at his hands, large, calloused, trembling slightly. It wasn't supposed to go that way, he said quietly. Emily's breath caught. What do you mean? Connolly's voice cracked. We were trying to scare him, keep him from running off after school. He'd been sneaking into the bus yard, playing around near the trucks. It was supposed to be a talk, that's all. But he got scared, started yelling. I grabbed him. He fell, hit his head. The words hung heavy in the air. Emily's heart pounded. And instead of calling for help, you covered it up? He nodded, tears forming. I panicked. Another deputy was there. He told me to keep quiet. Said no one would believe it was an accident. So we hid him near the creek. We thought we'd move him later, but the storm came. The water took him. Silence followed, sharp and unbearable. Emily's voice was steady but cold. You let his mother live 30 years in hell. Connolly's eyes filled. There isn't a day I don't see his face. You think I slept easy? No, Emily said softly. But you still slept. She stood, pulling out her handcuffs. Mark Connolly, you're under arrest for the death of Michael Reed. As she read him his rights, he didn't resist. He only whispered, maybe now the boy can rest. Outside, thunder rolled across the open plains, the sound of 30 years finally breaking. News of Mark Connolly's arrest rippled through Elkhart like a storm breaking over still water. For years, People had spoken his name with respect, even reverence. Now they whispered it with disbelief. Headlines spread across Kansas. Former deputy arrested in 1995, cold case. In a town where time had seemed frozen, truth had finally forced the clock to move again. Detective Emily Carter spent the next 48 hours in a blur of interviews and paperwork. Connolly's confession had been partial, emotional, but incomplete. He admitted to the struggle, the accident, the cover-up, but he refused to name the deputy who had helped him hide the truth. "He's gone," was all he said. "Let the dead rest." At the county courthouse, cameras gathered like vultures. Sheriff Hollis stood beside Emily during the press briefing. "Justice may come late," he said, "but it still comes. This department stands by the truth, no matter where it leads." Emily didn't speak. She let his words hang. Her eyes, calm but heavy, said enough. Sarah Reed sat on the front row during the arraignment. Her hands clutched a folded piece of paper, a copy of Michael's missing poster. When Connolly was led into the courtroom in shackles, he paused briefly, looking in her direction. Their eyes met, one filled with quiet fury, the other with resignation. "I don't want revenge," Sarah had told Emily earlier that morning. "I just want to know my boy mattered." "He did," Emily said softly. "And now everyone knows it." During the trial, the prosecution built their case around the physical evidence and Connolly's own words. The defense argued exhaustion, fear, and human error, that it was an accident buried under panic. But no argument could wash away 30 years of silence. Witnesses came forward. Old deputies spoke of inconsistencies they had ignored. A retired janitor recalled seeing a patrol car near the school that evening, its lights off. Piece by piece, the story of that night reassembled itself, not as a mystery anymore, but as a tragedy no one had dared face. When the verdict was read, the courtroom sat in perfect stillness. Guilty of manslaughter, obstruction of justice, and tampering with evidence. Connolly closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his lined face. Sarah didn't cry. She just exhaled, as if releasing a breath she'd been holding since 1995. Afterward, she met Emily outside the courthouse. The autumn air was crisp and the courthouse bell chimed noon. "He'll serve time," Emily said quietly. "It's not enough, but it's something." Sarah nodded. "Nothing ever brings them back, but maybe now he can rest." She opened her purse and took out Michael's old notebook, the one she'd kept sealed in a drawer for years. She walked to the courthouse steps and placed it there gently, as if leaving it for him. The wind caught its pages, flipping them softly before closing it again. Emily watched her go, knowing that justice, however imperfect, had finally found its way to Elkhart. Months passed after the verdict, and Elkhart began to breathe again, slowly, cautiously, like a town relearning how to live with the truth. The shock had faded into a quiet acceptance, but the scars remained. Some people still refused to believe that Mark Connolly, the man who had once worn their trust like a badge, could have been part of something so terrible. Others simply stopped speaking about it, as though silence could somehow restore the illusion of safety. Detective Emily Carter stayed on in Morton County, though the weight of the case followed her everywhere. Her face had become familiar to locals. Some greeted her with gratitude, others with cold eyes. Yet she didn't regret reopening the investigation. Every time she drove past the school, now freshly painted and bustling with children, she reminded herself that justice, even delayed, had meaning. Sarah Reed spent that first winter in reflection. She visited Michael's resting place each Sunday, leaving small tokens, a baseball card, a new notebook, sometimes just a folded note that read, "I love you, always." The media requests had faded, the reporters moved on, but her mission hadn't. She turned the Reed Foundation into something larger, expanding it statewide. Its goal wasn't vengeance, it was protection, creating a network to prevent other families from facing the silence she had endured. During an interview for a Wichita paper, the reporter asked, "Do you ever feel forgiveness?" Sarah took a long breath before answering. "Forgiveness and peace aren't the same thing. I don't forgive what happened, but I've stopped letting it own me." Emily read that quote days later and felt an unexpected sense of calm. In the chaos of investigation and truth-seeking, she had often forgotten the simple humanity at the heart of the story, a mother, a boy, a town learning to confront what it once ignored. Spring came early that year. The wheat fields rippled gold under warm winds, and for the first time in decades, Elkhart hosted a community fair again. It wasn't grand, just music, food, laughter. Yet for those who remembered 1995, it meant something profound. Life had found its way back into the soil. At the fair, Emily and Sarah crossed paths near a booth selling lemonade. They smiled, the kind of smile born not from happiness but understanding. "You staying long?" Sarah asked. "Maybe," Emily said. "There's still work to do here. Not on the case, just with people." Sarah nodded. "You did right by him. Michael would have liked you." For a moment they stood in silence, watching children chase each other across the grass. The sound of their laughter carried on the wind, bright and pure, untouched by the weight of history. When Emily drove home that night, the horizon blazed orange against the darkening sky. She thought about Michael Reed, not as a case, not as a tragedy, but as a reminder of why truth mattered. The past could never be undone, but it could be faced, named, and finally laid to rest. The Kansas plains stretched endlessly beneath a soft spring sun, the wind sweeping through the wheat fields like a sigh of release. Nearly 30 years after Michael Reed's disappearance, Elkhart stood quieter now, not silenced by fear, but by reflection. Time had reshaped the story from a wound into a lesson, one etched deep into the town's identity. Detective Emily Carter walked along the old road where Michael had last been seen. The gravel crunched beneath her boots, and she could almost hear the echoes of that distant day, a boy's laughter, the hum of a bus engine, a mother's voice calling into the wind. She had solved many cases in her career, but none had carved into her soul like this one. Justice, she'd learned, wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes it was about truth finally speaking after decades of silence. Later that afternoon, she visited Sarah Reed's home one final time. The porch still held the same old rocking chair, but the woman who sat in it had changed. Sarah looked older, yes, but there was light in her eyes again, a fragile peace that had taken a lifetime to earn. "I wanted to thank you," Emily said. Sarah shook her head. "You didn't do it for me. You did it for him." "I think," Emily replied softly, "he helped us both." They sat in comfortable quiet, the air warm and still. Somewhere down the road, church bells chimed the hour. Sarah smiled faintly. "You know, for years I prayed for an answer. I thought if I got it, I'd feel whole again. Turns out you don't get whole. You just learn how to live around the missing pieces." Emily nodded. "That's enough sometimes." Before leaving, Emily placed a small envelope on the porch railing. Inside was a photograph, Michael's case file number stamped beside the words "closed." Justice served. For Sarah, it wasn't closure in the way she once imagined, but it was something she could hold on to. As Emily drove out of town, the sky deepened into gold. The radio murmured a country song about time and forgiveness, and she thought about how truth, though painful, could still heal. She whispered to herself, some stories never end, they just find their voice. In the years that followed, the Reed Foundation continued to grow, helping families across the Midwest find hope where none seemed left. Elkhart became a symbol, not of tragedy, but of perseverance. And in every school hallway, every church bulletin board, Michael's story remained, reminding everyone that silence protects no one. Justice had come late to Kansas, but it had come, and with it, the quiet promise that the truth, once spoken, could never again be buried. If stories like this move you, stories of truth, perseverance, and justice that refuses to fade, subscribe to our channel and join us as we uncover more real cases where time couldn't bury the truth. And when you're ready, click the next video on your screen to continue exploring the real stories that remind us. Even after decades, the truth still finds a way home.